the convoy of military trucks rolled into the pristine flower-lined streets of Maplewood Estates like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. Armored Humvees, camouflaged jeeps and uniformed soldiers poured into the neighborhood, their heavy boots thudding against the pavement. Curtains fluttered as curious and increasingly alarmed residents peeked through their windows. Dogs barked. A man dropped his morning coffee in shock, the mug shattering on his porch. And at the very center of it all stood Karen Whitmore, a queen frozen in absolute horror. Mrs. Whitmore, a deep voice cut through the air, calm yet charged with authority. We need to have a conversation. Karen's lips parted but no words came out. Her manicured fingers gripped the edges of her silk robe as a decorated military officer, stern, broad-shouldered and flanked by 2 soldiers, stepped forward. He wasn't here for a friendly neighborhood chat. 12 hours earlier, the neighborhood had been its usual self. Sterile, quiet and suffocatingly regulated. Karen Whitmore ruled with an iron fist, her kingdom bound by a thick HOA rulebook and a bottomless well of pettiness. Residents feared her clipboard, her passive-aggressive emails, and above all her ability to fine people into submission. She had fined Mrs. Ellington $200 for having sunflowers that were too tall. She had sent warning letters to the Garcia family because their welcome mat was unapproved. But none of her acts had been as outrageous, as heartless as the one she pulled on Jake Reynolds. Jake was a Marine veteran, a man who had served 2 tours overseas, only to return home with an injury that left him wheelchair-bound. He had purchased his home in Maplewood Estates 3 years ago, believing the quiet streets would be a peaceful place to recover. He hadn't anticipated Karen. At first she was just a nuisance, sending him letters about the length of his grass, frowning disapprovingly at his service dog, Buddy, as if the loyal golden retriever was an eyesore. But things escalated when Jake had a wheelchair ramp installed in front of his house. It was a necessity, not a decoration. Without it, simple tasks like going to the grocery store or checking the mail became battles against gravity. Karen, however, saw it differently. The ramp, she claimed, was an unapproved alteration that clashed with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. She sent formal warnings, emails, and then a final notice. If the ramp was not removed within a week, the HOA would take action. Jake ignored her. He had bigger things to worry about, like, say, living. The night before the convoy arrived, Jake had gone to bed, unaware that in the dead of night, Karen had hired a crew to dismantle his ramp. They worked quickly and efficiently like burglars, tearing apart the structure board by board. By morning, all that was left was a patch of dirt and a pile of broken wood stacked neatly at the curb. Jake woke up to Buddy whining beside the door. The dog sensed something was wrong. And when Jake wheeled himself over and opened it, reality hit him like a brick to the chest. The ramp was gone. Not vandalized, not damaged, completely gone. For a moment he just sat there, gripping the wheels of his chair, staring at the spot where it had been. He wasn't the kind of man to break easily. He had faced war, injuries, and nightmares that clawed at his mind in the dead of night. But this was something else. This was personal. He called Karen. Straight to voicemail. He called the HOA office. A receptionist with an artificially sweet voice informed him that the removal was unfortunate but necessary due to non-compliance with HOA regulations. Jake wasn't sure what he felt more, rage, exhaustion, or disbelief. Maybe all 3. He wasn't the kind of man to start fights. But he knew how to finish them. And so he made a different call. Not to the police, not to the city council. He called someone with real power. Colonel Sam Carter picked up on the first ring. 12 hours later, Maplewood Estates was under siege. The military convoy had arrived with an air of quiet menace, moving with the kind of discipline that made even the bravest civilians step back. Soldiers fanned out across the neighborhood, scanning the area like they were on a mission. In a way they were. Karen had no idea what to do. She wasn't used to people ignoring her authority. She had spent years terrorizing homeowners with fines and complaints, relishing the tiny power she wielded. But now, standing in her bathrobe watching military personnel surround her, she looked smaller. Colonel Carter stopped a foot away from her. His presence was suffocating, a mountain of a man in his decorated uniform. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone neutral but edged with something sharp. "We have a problem." Karen swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch. Her voice, usually dripping with condescension, came out thinner than she intended. I don't understand. What's going on? Carter didn't blink. You illegally removed a federally funded accessibility structure from the home of a disabled veteran. Karen's face paled. It was an HOA violation. It was a federal violation, Carter interrupted. You destroyed government-funded property that was granted under the Veterans Affairs program. That makes this not just an HOA matter but a legal one. Jake wheeled himself forward, Buddy at his side. He had been silent so far, letting the spectacle unfold. But now he spoke. Karen, he said, his voice steady, almost casual. You really screwed up this time. The weight of the situation finally settled in. Karen's hands shook slightly as she tried to regain control. This isn't fair. This is harassment. You can't just show up here like this. Carter raised an eyebrow. Funny. That's what Jake said when you had his property destroyed in the middle of the night. The crowd murmured. Whispers of disapproval rippled through the gathering. It was one thing for Karen to be an overzealous HOA tyrant. It was another to blatantly target a disabled veteran. Even her most loyal followers were backing away. Karen stammered, reaching for some kind of excuse, but there was none. And then, to her absolute horror, she spotted the worst possible thing. A news van pulling up. A reporter hopped out, camera already rolling. Jake smirked. Smile for the news, Karen. Karen had always believed she was untouchable, that her position in the HOA made her the queen of Maplewood Estates. But as she stood there, trapped under the weight of her own arrogance, surrounded by military personnel, neighbors, and a news crew eager for a scandal, she realized something. She had just declared war. And she had already lost. Colonel Sam Carter didn't move as Karen sputtered, her face shifting between shock and rage. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their eyes bouncing between the decorated military officer and the woman who had terrorized them for years. Karen had spent so much time wielding power over the neighborhood that she never once imagined being the one on the receiving end of it. But now, standing in her silk robe, her manicured nails gripping the edges of her clipboard like a lifeline, she was starting to understand something terrifying. She had no control here. Jake sat in his wheelchair, arms crossed, Buddy lying calmly at his feet. He wasn't smiling, but there was a certain satisfaction in his expression as he watched Karen squirm. She had pushed too far, and now she was getting a taste of something she had never experienced before. Accountability. I don't understand what all this is about, Karen finally forced out, her voice shrill and uneven. This is an overreaction. I was simply enforcing community guidelines as I have always done. Colonel Carter tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone instinctively straighten, you didn't just enforce guidelines. You destroyed property that was federally funded for a disabled veteran. That is not just a violation of HOA policy. It is a violation of federal law. Karen's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had spent so many years throwing around rules, threatening homeowners with fines and legal action, but now the script had flipped. She wasn't the one holding the rulebook anymore. Federal law, she finally managed to croak out. That doesn't make sense. This is private property. The HOA has jurisdiction here. You can't just show up with soldiers and... Carter took a step closer, cutting off her rambling with a slow, deliberate nod. The ramp was installed under the Veterans Affairs Special Housing Adaptation Grant. That means its destruction qualifies as an obstruction of federal assistance. Do you know what that means, Mrs. Whitmore? Karen's face twisted, trying to hold on to whatever little authority she thought she had left. I don't care what kind of grant it was, she snapped. This is a private community. He violated the rules. The ramp was an eyesore. The HOA has a right to maintain the appearance of the neighborhood. The crowd murmured in disbelief. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Detached. Completely devoid of remorse. Jake had known Karen was heartless, but even he was a little surprised at how far she was willing to dig herself into a hole. Carter exhaled slowly, as if giving her one last chance to realize her mistake before things got worse. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, do you understand that you could face legal action for this? Karen stiffened. Legal action? A small smile ghosted across Carter's face, but it wasn't kind. Destruction of federally funded disability accommodations is a serious offense. But let's not stop there. He pulled a folder from under his arm, flipping it open. It seems this isn't the first time your leadership of this HOA has come into question. The tension in the air changed instantly. Karen's entire body went rigid, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her face. Carter glanced at the papers in his hands, reading aloud as he flipped through the pages. Multiple complaints of financial discrepancies in HOA funds. Unlawful fines issued without board approval. Allegations of discrimination against residents with disabilities and non-English-speaking homeowners. And my personal favorite, misuse of HOA funds for personal landscaping expenses. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen's fingers clenched tighter around her clipboard, her knuckles turning white. That's ridiculous, she stammered. I have done nothing wrong. Those are lies. Baseless accusations. Carter didn't even acknowledge her protests. He turned the folder around, showing several pages filled with official complaints, receipts, and even screenshots of emails. I'm afraid the state doesn't agree with you, he said. This is more than enough for a formal investigation. Karen's face drained of color. Jake watched with quiet amusement. It was poetic justice. For years, Karen had lorded over everyone with the HOA as her weapon, making people miserable just because she could. But now, the tables had turned, and she was finally realizing what it felt like to have the weight of consequences bearing down on her. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. She charged me $300 for not having my lawn gnomes facing the same direction. She made me repaint my mailbox twice because she said the first shade of blue was too aggressive. She forced me to take down my daughter's swing set because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. The stories poured out, residents emboldened by the realization that Karen's reign of terror might finally be coming to an end. People who had been too afraid to speak out before were now lining up to throw their grievances onto the pile. Karen's eyes darted around wildly, her world crumbling around her. She had always relied on fear to maintain control, but now fear was the very thing turning people against her. Jake leaned back in his wheelchair, watching with mild satisfaction. Looks like you've got a bit of a PR problem, Karen. Karen whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing. This is your fault, she hissed. You did this. You and your soldier friends. This is harassment. You people don't belong here. Carter's expression darkened. You people. Karen's mouth snapped shut. The moment stretched. The weight of what she had just said, the tone she had used, settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Jake tilted his head, pretending to consider. Whoa. You almost made that sound like a slur. Karen's breath came fast and shallow. She was losing control and she knew it. Carter turned to one of the soldiers at his side. Get the VA representative on the line. And notify the county office. We'll be filing for an official investigation into HOA financial practices. Karen's voice wobbled. Wait, please, let's be reasonable. We can talk about this. Carter's gaze was steely. That's what we're doing, Mrs. Whitmore. A second military jeep pulled up, this one carrying a man in a suit, an official VA representative. The moment he stepped out, Karen's fate was sealed. Jake exhaled slowly, watching the chaos unfold around him. He had expected to fight a long, grueling battle with Karen and the HOA. But he hadn't expected it to unravel this fast. As the VA rep approached, clipboard in hand, he turned to Jake and extended a hand. Mr. Reynolds, on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs, I'd like to personally apologize for what you've been put through. This is unacceptable and we'll be making sure you get everything you need, immediately. Jake shook his hand, nodding. Appreciate it. Karen, meanwhile, was in full meltdown mode. You can't do this. You can't. I run this neighborhood. The VA rep turned to her, his face unreadable. Not anymore, Mrs. Whitmore. Jake sat back in his chair, watching as Karen realized, far too late, that she had just lost everything. Karen Whitmore had spent years controlling Maplewood Estates with an iron grip, but as she stood in front of her crumbling empire, it was clear that her reign had come to a spectacular and very public end. The military wasn't leaving. The VA representative had already begun making calls, and the HOA board members were looking anywhere but at her, as if distancing themselves from the sinking ship would somehow save them from drowning alongside her. Jake sat in his wheelchair, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about his ramp anymore. This was about every single person Karen had bullied, every ridiculous fine she had handed out, every unnecessary rule she had enforced just to remind people she was in charge. That power was slipping through her fingers now, and she knew it. She turned to the HOA board, desperation creeping into her voice. "You're not seriously going along with this, are you? We have rights. This is an internal HOA matter." One of the board members, a frail-looking man in a too-tight polo, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Karen, we didn't know about the federal involvement. You never told us." Karen's face twisted with frustration. "Because it didn't matter. This is our community. We make the rules, and she jabbed a finger toward Jake, broke them." The VA representative stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Whitmore, that's not how the law works. Federal assistance programs override HOA policies. By tearing down that ramp, you didn't just break a rule. You violated federal disability rights. That comes with consequences." Karen swallowed hard. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. Consequences. The VA representative flipped through his clipboard. At minimum, a lawsuit. Possibly criminal charges, depending on what the investigation finds. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The neighbors murmured among themselves. Some looked smug, others just relieved. It was as if the entire neighborhood had suddenly woken up from a bad dream and realized that, without Karen, things might actually be normal again. The moment stretched, the weight of it pressing down on Karen's shoulders. And then, in a final desperate bid to reclaim even a sliver of her old power, she turned back to Jake. "This is your fault," she spat. "You could have followed the rules like everyone else, but no. You had to make a scene. You had to call in your army friends. You people always think the world owes you something just because you went off to war." She didn't get to finish. Colonel Carter, who had been silent up until this point, took a single step forward. That was all it took. Karen's breath hitched and she took a stumbling step backward. The colonel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone measured, deadly calm, "I suggest you stop talking." Karen seemed to shrink in on herself. She opened her mouth again, then shut it just as quickly. Jake smirked. He had seen his fair share of intimidation tactics, and Carter hadn't even tried yet. A police car pulled into the neighborhood, its lights flashing but sirens silent. A uniformed officer stepped out, looking over the situation with mild curiosity before walking up to the VA representative. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then the officer turned toward Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "we need to ask you a few questions." Karen shook her head, laughing nervously. "Oh, this is ridiculous. You can't possibly think I did anything criminal." The officer didn't say anything. He just motioned for her to step forward. For a moment, it looked like she was going to argue. But then she saw the news camera, still rolling, capturing every second of her humiliation. Her entire body tensed, and slowly she stepped toward the officer. Jake leaned back in his wheelchair, watching as the police led Karen away to their car. She wasn't under arrest, not yet. But she would be answering questions. The moment she was gone, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed instantly. The tension that had been a constant presence for years seemed to evaporate. Neighbors looked at one another with a mix of relief and disbelief. The HOA board members scattered, knowing they would have their own reckoning soon enough. Colonel Carter turned to Jake. "You good?" Jake exhaled, nodding. "Better than I've been in a long time." The VA representative clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll get that ramp rebuilt immediately. And if there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask." Jake smirked. "Well, now that you mention it, I've been thinking about getting a much bigger ramp." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Bigger?" "Yeah," Jake said. "Something that really stands out. Maybe a nice bright color. Neon even." Carter chuckled. "I like the way you think." It didn't take long for the military personnel to start packing up, but the impact of their presence would linger for a long, long time. The neighbors, still buzzing with excitement, gathered around Jake's house, offering to help rebuild, to bring food, to finally, after all these years, get to know the man Karen had tried so hard to isolate. By the end of the day, work had already begun on the new ramp. But this time it wasn't just Jake and a contractor. It was the entire neighborhood pitching in, working together. That night, as Jake sat on his porch with Buddy curled up beside him, He watched as the last remaining members of the HOA board slunk off into the darkness. He knew it was only a matter of time before a new vote was held. And this time the neighborhood would choose wisely. A week later it was official. The HOA was under new management. And in a twist no one had seen coming, the new HOA president was none other than Jake Reynolds himself. The first thing he did? He held a bonfire in the middle of the cul-de-sac, and in front of the entire neighborhood he threw the old HOA rulebook straight into the flames. The cheers could be heard from 3 streets away. As the fire crackled and the weight of the past finally burned away, Jake couldn't help but laugh. Karen had spent years making Maplewood Estates a place of fear and control. Well, it was a home again.